Hi, I'm Gary, and this is episode 100 of EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, we're chatting with several EV and renewables enthusiasts about a number of topics, as today is the last episode of the season, and it's another roundtable. Before we start, I wanted to thank everyone for listening to the podcast. I started this about 2 years ago with Simon Rowe, and I thought I'd put together a small number of episodes about electric cars, but since then it's grown a little bit each month, and I've expanded to include topics in the renewable space, and now I find myself at an amazing 100 episodes, quite a milestone. Unbelievable. Thank you to everyone who listens regularly, to everyone who dips in when there's a topic they're interested in, and most of all to my patrons who help to keep the whole thing going with their financial help. Thank you. Today we're holding roundtable number 3. Links to the previous 2 roundtables are in the show notes, and if you've listened to those episodes, you'll know that we have a number of specially invited guests who come on and lead the discussion on various topics of interest in the EV or renewable space. So let me start by introducing the members of this season's EV Musings roundtable. Firstly, we have Stuart Reid, who's the head of Future Networks at SSEN, Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks. What he doesn't know about low voltage network and EV grid integration isn't worth knowing, and that's a direct quote from former guest and friend of the podcast, Jill Noel. Hello, Stuart.
That's a setup if I've ever heard one, yeah. Yeah.
Secondly, we have Jack Scarlett. You may have seen Jack on the Electroheads YouTube channel where he covers electric vehicle reviews and commentary, but he's been pushed very much to the forefront recently as the newest presenter on the Fully Charged show and the brand new head of automotive content there. I think that's right, Jack, isn't it?
Yeah, spot on, mate. Thanks. Lovely intro.
Welcome to the both of you. As with last season's roundtable, the format's quite simple. Each guest will lead a discussion on a specific EV or renewable topic. We all get to throw our 2 pence into the mix, and then when we're happy we've solved the world's problems, we'll move on to the next one. Today, we're discussing the following items: flexibility on public charge points, should Tesla open their supercharging network to other marques, and I'll be talking about slow charging cars on fast chargers. If we manage to get through those fairly quickly, I've got 1 or 2 other topics that we might throw into the mix, but we'll see how that goes. I'd like to start with Stuart, if I may. So, Stuart, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I suppose the first thing to get out there is I am an EV owner, so that's worth knowing, because I think one of the things about EVs is until you've actually had one, you don't really appreciate the pros, the cons, the challenges, and the debate that needs to be had. So I'll get that out there. But my day job, as you can imagine, head of Future Networks, involves looking at how networks are going to deal with decarbonisation in the future. So EVs are a massive part of that, and we've been working on EV related topics for over 10 years now. We had projects like My Electric Avenue quite a few years back. You mentioned Jill earlier on there. That was one of the projects we worked on with her, and we've been working with flexibility, energy storage, and all sorts of things. But it's really starting to come together now. We're starting to see some kind of real sort of investment in infrastructure and so on. And just by way of example, we've got a £41 million programme of investment that's just been signed off by a regulator, which is putting network in place from Oxford to Orkney and Dundee to Dorset, all allowing for different low-carbon technology investments. So it's really starting to happen and kick off, and we're starting to get into some of the real detail as well about the kind of the implications of this as well. So we've kicked off projects looking at disability and how electric vehicles are going to be compatible or not compatible with the needs of disabled drivers. So we're working with people like Connected Curb and Disabled Motoring UK on projects looking at not just the challenges that disabled drivers may have, but how to overcome them, and also some of the opportunities, things like vehicle to grid and allowing an electric car to keep the lights on in a vulnerable customer's home during a power interruption, could be immensely valuable, for someone that could particularly benefit from that sort of additional liability. So there's just so many opportunities associated with EVs. It's an unbelievably exciting area to be in. The topic I wanted to talk about today was one that comes up quite often, and that's flexibility. I mentioned about the My Electric Avenue project we did a few years back, and that looked at flexibility in home charging. And as an EV owner, it's pretty easy to be flexible in terms of when you charge your home. If it's sitting in the drive overnight, you can move your charge period around to take advantage of low cost energy and so on, and it's relatively straightforward. But when you're out on the road network, when you're on the journey, how does flexibility work in that scenario? And one of the biggest challenges that we've got out there is that there's little doubt that when public charging is going in, one of the things that can add costs and also delay the establishment of public charging is the connection to the electrical network. And there's a limit to what you can do with that, because these reinforcements that are done to the network require physical work. So you're digging up streets, you're laying cables, you have to get consents and all sorts of different things to get these things. And so there's no silver bullet that says you can have instantaneous upgrades on the network. So there'll always be a delay, and there'll always be a cost associated with getting that connection. But one of the points is the electrical network is a bit like the road network. It's not always busy. But when we put in a new connection for a charge point, we build a network that is suitable for the peak demand that you're going to get in that particular area. But just like the road network, there are options to kind of work flexibly. If you think about it, when the road network is full, we use junctions, we use traffic lights, we use different ways of controlling flow. And that's possible as well with electricity. You can control flow. But what would that mean? What that would mean would be, for public charging, would people be willing to accept flexibility in the way that they charge a car? So just to kind of put some kind of reality into this, if you turn up at a charger now and it says it's a 100 kilowatt charger, you expect to be able to get 100 kilowatts at any time you plug in, subject to your charge curve in your car. If you were willing to accept that on certain times of the day, that charger was no longer a 100 kilowatt charger, but was a 50 kilowatt charger, does that make it any less valuable to the traveller going from A to B? And I would suggest it doesn't, because there's the options there. What if on ZapMap in future, or other platforms that are out there, you're able to see that actually there's a charger available in this area, but this particular point in time is limited to 25 kilowatts instead of the 70 or whatever that is normally set at. Would that be a significant downside, or is it a price worth paying in order to get more charging infrastructure out there and to get it out quicker? So that's really the challenge. Would we be willing to accept flexibility in our public charging? And what sort of things would you need to consider about that, and what sort of pros and cons would there be to that sort of approach? So that's the challenge. What do you think?
Oh, now that is a fantastic question. I've got my own thoughts on that, but I'm going to open it to Jack to start with to see whether he's got any thoughts and comments.
Certainly. Well, I think my first reaction to that is I would put myself through a lot of terrible things for there to be more chargers, first and foremost, because that's what we want and need desperately, is just more places to plug in. I think the point about sort of reducing the amount of power that's going through them by spreading it out across multiple chargers, that's a pill I'd be willing to swallow, even if queuing up for one really rapid charger and then using it very quickly. That somehow feels worse than plugging straight into a slightly slower one, but actually being plugged in from the get-go. There's just something about waiting for a charger that is just deeply unpleasant, isn't there?
Yeah, it's the uncertainty, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think sort of clarity of information, more detail about what is available and what we can expect when we arrive at a charge point would be a pretty big life changer. Because as long as there's no nasty surprises, you're willing to tolerate minor inconvenience, aren't you?
My initial reaction on that was, well, hang on, we want faster chargers. Grid server rolling out the 350 kilowatt ones. It's going to be a backward step to sort of say, well, no, we're now going to limit them. But of course, the devil is in the details on this. Are we talking about, this fabled sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 7 o'clock in the evening where the demand is high on the grid generally? Is that the kind of time when we might be dropping these down, or will it be random, or how do we see that working, Stuart?
Yeah, it's certainly not going to be random. It's going to be forecastable, because each bit of the network has a very different demand profile. If you've got a lot of industry in one area, you might have a peak at a different time of day from a domestic area. So the typical things you hear about the network being full at particular times of day is at a national level, yeah. But at a local level, it can often be quite different. And the kind of model I think I could live with would be, if for each area you had, let's say, this particular charge bay, we expect it to be fully available from these times X to Y, and 50% available from Z to W or whatever. So you've got that clarity in terms of how likely it is to be constrained at any particular point in time. And if you think about it, it's no different from having to predict when the bays are going to be full as well. So it's just a kind of extension of a challenge that you already have as an electric vehicle owner. So does that make sense to you?
It does. Is this? I think for me as a user, if I'm turfing up at a charger, obviously, as Jack said earlier on, we want the chargers to be available. We want more of as many of them as we can. Now, if it also means I've then got to look and say, well, on this particular location, or maybe these particular charges at this location, the charge will be reduced between these times.
Mm-hmm.
As long as we know that with an amount of certainty and an amount of advance notice, I think people will be happy to sort of go along with that. It's, turning up at one that you normally use that gets a good 150, 200 kilowatt charge, and then suddenly, today, just for no reason that we can really identify, we're now down to 45 or 50 kilowatts. I think people are going to push back against that.
Yeah, if it becomes unpredictable and random, I could see the point there. Yeah. Because one of the other scenarios of flexibility is that the charge point provider installs energy storage alongside the charge point itself, and the battery is used to kind of smooth out these peaks and troughs. So the customer experience is as good as it can be. They're getting full charging at all times, and the battery's doing the hard work. But the downside of that is that's kind of a premium service. So I suppose another question is, would you be willing to pay less if it was a flexible charger with that amount of uncertainty, and pay more where you've got the certainty of a battery backed up scenario? And that's an interesting one from a business model perspective for the charge point operators, because they can then make clearer decisions and have a clearer kind of return for the investment in the technology that provides that guarantee of charging capacity. There's quite a lot in that when you start to think it through.
It is, as I say, the devil is in the details with things like that. I think personally, if you start to look at it from a cost point of view and say, yes, this is going to be the price for the full power charging, this is going to be the reduced price when we have constraints on the network. If people are aware of that in advance, you may even get people to go, well, I might deliberately try and charge at times when the demand is high and the actual charge rate is low, because I want the lower cost associated with it. So it gives people options, and I think options are always good.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose the thing that's in my mind is, if you don't have these flexible options, then it's more than likely that charger will not exist, because the connection can't be upgraded in the time to allow it to be installed. So it may be there maybe 1 year earlier than it would have been other, or maybe 2 years earlier than it would have been otherwise. So I'm kind of thinking, well, what is there really to lose? As long as we can get some sort of model that doesn't result in people having such a bad experience that it starts to push back against the kind of uptake of electric vehicles. That's the kind of one thing in my mind that needs to be right, which is why I think it's a good discussion to have.
Completely, totally. What it does bring to mind is, let me see if I can get the name right. Have you heard of the FreeWire Boost charger units?
I can't say that I have. Tell me about them.
I believe it's an American company. BP Pulse they've got one installed at their headquarters. It's basically, I think it's like a 150 kilowatt charger, but it's got an inbuilt battery in it, and you can actually plug it into what is effectively a 7 kilowatt output. So it gives the power of a high power charger, but the actual drain of the from the grid is the equivalent of just a normal 7 kilowatt charger. So something like that, if you start to roll those out, you get to the point where you can put those in a lot more places than you could, because you don't then have to hit this issue that Stuart's been talking about of having to extend the grid capability and put in all the the future proofing. It becomes a lot easier to roll those out, and they're a lot cheaper.
That is a very fancy sounding piece of kit. And then presumably the battery pack charges from the grid during off-peak hours?
It's constantly charging.
Okay.
And I should have looked this up in advance. I forget what the actual size of the battery is, but you can do something like 2 or 3 full charges on a fairly big battered car before it actually runs down. But because it's constantly running in the background at 7 kilowatts, then you're constantly charging. You don't have these areas where it's not doing anything, and then suddenly you get somebody coming in with a Taycan who wants 250 kilowatts instantaneously. So
that sounds like an elegant solution to me. I'm sure there are logistical and cost challenges around those types of charges as well.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer Stuart's earlier question, I think people will be perfectly willing to pay slightly more for a charger that is guaranteed to give you that maximum charge when you're in a rush, and slightly less and wait slightly longer for that same charger during its hours of demand where the power is being shared across multiple units. But again, I just think it boils down to transparency and availability of information. I think we just want to know what we're going to get when we show up to that charge point, and there's room for improvement in that area.
Stuart, on a related topic, you're aware, of course, that our friends at GridServe/Electric Highway are upgrading the current motorway service area units.
Yes.
Now, this is just me sort of asking a sort of a blue sky question. If they're going from, let's say, 1 or maybe 2 of the old DBT 50 kilowatt units, and suddenly they're putting in 2 or maybe 3 of the ABB 350 kilowatt units, are we assuming that somebody's been in contact with people like yourselves to say, right, we need this extra power going in, or are they trying to sort of fudge the system a bit and put more power, more units in without really upgrading the underlying power that's going in there?
Well, almost certainly that there have been applications going in for upgrading, but it's actually an interesting piece, because the very same topic we've just talked about there, flexibility, can be applied at that local level as well. So if you've got your charge curve on your battery, and you've got 3 units, the probability of all these 3 units being sitting at maximum charge at all the time is low. So they have got options for some flexing within installations. Particularly, the more charge points you have, the more kind of diversity there is, and the more options they have for kind of thinking about flexibility on site. But yeah, to answer your question, more than certainly would have applied for upgrades to the connections in the background. Yeah.
Okay, all right. It just seems that they're going through at a hell of a rate of upgrading. I think they've done 62 of the 160 locations in the last, whatever it is, 5 or 6 weeks. That seems to be a lot of upgrades needed to the power connections in a short period of time. Is that feasible?
Not all. A lot of sites have capacity at them already. So it does really depend on what sort of initial size of connection they've actually put in. So there's some, although there's quite a lot discussed about places where there are limitations on the network, there are plenty of places where there's not limitations. So I dare say there'll be a mix of sites where they're having to upgrade, sites where they're maybe temporarily constraining their connection, and there'll be sites where they've got the capacity anyway. Yeah, and it'll be a mix of these, but they're across a whole of different network operators. So I wouldn't know myself.
Okay, that's right. That's probably accounting for how they're trying, or the actual rollout plan, because they seem to be doing it in a fairly haphazard way, but maybe it's related to some of those issues that you've been talking about which places actually have the capacity at the moment. Right. Do we want to draw a line under that particular topic, unless Jack has anything else to say?
I think I am replete.
Fantastic. Well, take a deep breath, because I'm going to hand over to you now, and you're going to talk about a subject that's very close to a lot of people's hearts, apparently, which is, should Tesla open their supercharging network to other brands?
Yes, this is a fairly spicy one, and as I'll get to at the end, it's highly topical based on a certain tweet from a certain someone less than 24 hours ago. So here we go. In my opinion, the single biggest advantage of Tesla ownership versus owning a non Tesla EV is not the astonishing self driving technology or unmatched long range capabilities, but the supercharger network. Tesla's chargers are among the very best. They're fast, they're simple to use, they're well maintained, they're abundant, and perhaps best of all, they're for Tesla use only. And this exclusivity means that as a Tesla driver, you hardly ever have to wait for a charge. In fact, I personally have never had to wait for a charge while in a Tesla. Now, outside of Tesla superchargers, it goes without saying that the UK charge network is still a bit lacking. It's improving remarkably fast, but for the time being, if you do drive a non-Tesla EV, it's a fact of life that you are going to have a handful of traumatic charger experiences from time to time. Just last week, I almost got into a fist fight with an Ionity rapid charger because I arrived with mere miles of juice left on my Renault Zoe press car, only to discover that the charger was so shiny and new that it actually hadn't been turned on yet. So, my question for today is, should Tesla open its supercharger network out to other brands? As EVs surge in popularity, does it no longer make sense for such a big chunk of the UK's chargers to be limited to one brand? Now, on the one hand, and I think this would probably be my stance if I was a Tesla owner, Tesla got there first. It invested a fortune into cultivating the world's largest charging network at a time when most car makers hadn't even begun flirting with the idea of building an EV. And that foresight has put the company in a position of immense strength. So, why on earth would they throw all of that away and inconvenience their existing customers by making superchargers busier just to help out a load of people who bought from rival companies? On the other hand, you might argue that sharing the supercharger network just makes sense, that it's absurd to force 5 people to queue for one BP pulse charger at a service station while a bank of perfectly good superchargers lie unused next door. And more to the point, you could argue that if Tesla is really for the cause, if it really is on a mission to kill off ICE and make this electric thing happen as quickly as possible, as Elon Musk often states, then the philanthropic thing to do is share the love, open out the network, and make running an EV, any EV, as simple, painless, and appealing a proposition as possible. Now, before I throw this out to the table, I should caveat this by saying that just a few hours before we began recording this, Elon Musk rather vaguely declared on Twitter that the supercharger network will open up to other brands later this year. Exactly how much weight to put behind an Elon tweet is a discussion for another day, but I'd love to hear your chaps' thoughts on this issue.
Contentious.
It is. Go on, Stuart.
Well, if I were a Tesla owner, I'd have one answer, but I'm not a Tesla owner. So I think opening up to me is the right thing to do. This whole journey is about net zero, about removing diesel burners from the roads, and to not open it up to me seems wrong. And ironically, actually, the last time I charged at a public charging site was Gretna Green 2 weeks ago, and there was a queue at the Tesla site, and there was 2 CCS units sitting next to it with nobody on them, which was quite interesting.
That is a rare sight.
I even took a photograph of it. It was such a significant point. But I certainly would be on the view that the greater good has got to be the way to go with this. And ultimately, as well as how sustainable is a model where you have chargers that are dedicated to specific car manufacturers. If you scale this up, how does that work? How much redundancy of charging infrastructures does that result in the UK? And so thinking the long game, it's just got to open up, surely.
I've been trying to follow some of the conversations that have been going on social media about this, and as you say, it is very much split down the middle. There's all those people who have the Teslas who are going, no, there's going to be queues, we're not going to be able to get on. And then there's all those people who don't have it going, yes, you need to open this up, because if they're as good as you say, then, why keep that for yourself? And as I said on the previous answer, the devil is in the details on this, because, people are looking at this and going, well, does Elon mean that we're going to open up all of the chargers on all of the network, on all of the continents and the countries to all EVs? Or is it a case of, well, we're going to open some units at some locations to some brands? And until we know what the detail is underneath that, it's going to be very difficult to make a definitive answer about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I've got to say, personally, I subscribe to sort of the mantra that Elon Musk put out, which is, the mission is to get internal combustion engines off the road. If one of the ways to speed that up is to make some and or all of the supercharger network available to some and or all other EVs, then that has to be a good thing. But one of the things that a lot of Tesla owners come back at is, well, hang on, we are paying for the supercharger in the price of the car. It's more expensive because we've had to cover the cost of that. And I can see that to a certain extent. But is that true for the Model 3? I mean, it certainly was for the Model S and the Model X, and that's why they got free supercharging.
Yeah.
But with the Model 3, are they still paying for it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. It's such a fascinating position that Tesla have sort of landed themselves in by going early, whereby now they have to sort of face this moral dilemma of do they further the cause that the company is built around, and in doing so, aggravate and inconvenience their existing customer base.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're absolutely right. The devil is in the details, and I have no doubt that they'll ensure that they go about this in a way that maintains priority for Tesla customers and owners, whether that means that half of the superchargers at each location remain Tesla exclusive, or simply that us non-Tesla drivers pay triple just to sort of encourage us to look elsewhere first and use the Tesla chargers if we really have to. I know it's been confirmed in a sort of more official way that this is happening in Norway next year, end of next year, I believe. So this tweet from Elon Musk yesterday is a bit of a revelation, and I'm inclined to take it with a small pinch of salt because there was a lot of fanfare about we're doing this in Norway late 2022, and for him to drop this bomb in actually a reply to someone else's tweet yesterday saying we're doing it everywhere this year. We just need to see what that looks like in detail, I think.
I saw one particular tweet from obviously a Tesla owner, and she said, now let me rephrase what I was going to say. Traditionally, Tesla owners are of the voice that these are the best cars in the world. And this tweet that came out from, I forget who she was, but she said, no, it's the superchargers that make Tesla so good. So it's kind of subtly changed from it's the car that's good to it's the network that's good. And I don't have an opinion one way or the other about which one of those is correct, but it's interesting how now that it looks like the supercharger, the sanctity of the supercharger network might be broken, they're coming out in force to say, no, it's the network that makes Tesla what it is, and we need to keep it away from the riffraff, etc. So again, devil in the details, and I think this is one of those discussions that's going to go on and on and on.
I am sort of inclined to agree with that statement. I think there's a lot of things that make Teslas extremely special, but I think that the gap is closing faster to the cars versus the opposition. Whereas when it comes to the supercharger network versus the opposition, I think that gap is still fairly enormous. And so that one particular advantage of Tesla ownership is really beginning to stand out. And yeah, it's something you have to consider. If you're going to buy a non-Tesla electric car, you sort of just need to make peace with the fact that it's going to be a little bit more logistically challenging.
Yes. Yeah. Although with the grid serve electric highway solution, I mean, they're now coming up with multiple hubs. They're coming up with the electric forecourts. They're obviously upgrading all the existing motorway service ones. They're also looking at auto charge, which is the plug and play. So, from a functionality point of view, it is not that dissimilar to the supercharger network. The advantage that the supercharger network has, obviously, is there's a lot more of them at the moment, and they've got the head start in the market. So Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how it affects charge point installers' plans for installing new infrastructure. If suddenly you've got 20 or 30 competing charge points sitting at a site you were going to develop already, that's one maybe unintended consequence would be interesting to think about. Do you actually, by opening up the Tesla infrastructure, do you temporarily stifle investment in other charging infrastructure? As a thought, I don't know
That's
if
a
that's
really
an
interesting
issue or
point.
not, but yeah.
Yes, no, Jack, you were saying that is an interesting point, because my understanding is that the location of a lot of the superchargers, yes, each site has, I think, a minimum of 4 and anything up to about 64 different chargers, depending on where you are in the world. But they've focused them in certain key areas, which are high traffic throughputs and things like that. I mean, everybody talks about Wales not having any charger infrastructure in the centre, and that's quite right. There are only 2 Tesla superchargers in Wales. One's down in Cardiff, the other one's up in Rhyl or Llandudno up on the top coast. So, even Tesla aren't going into a lot of these areas that are, what I call the charger wastelands. Maybe if we get the situation that Stuart just talked about there, maybe a lot of the other companies, instead of trying to compete with Tesla, they're now going to focus a lot more on some of the areas that are lesser served by chargers at the moment.
Which would be positive, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the other thing, from a network perspective, whenever anyone installs charging infrastructure, they effectively reserve the capacity of the network. So that if you've got a megawatt's worth of chargers in a street, then anyone else that comes along requires additional capacity over and above that. So from some perspectives, it's quite wasteful having charging infrastructure sitting there doing nothing, holding up capacity. So there's some good aspects from that angle as well. Although that whole flexibility debate we had earlier on would fix that problem as well. It's kind of 2 ways of doing it there, which is interesting interaction between the 2 topics there.
Oh, yeah, I do like that, because are you effectively saying that it could be possible if we put that sort of flexibility in, that your version 3 superchargers at 250 kilowatts might only come up to 100 kilowatts at certain times of the day for certain locations?
Yeah, exactly. What you're doing with flexibility is making maximum use of what's available in that area at any point in time. You're kind of pushing the limits of what can be done in the system, rather than going for the normal conservative type arrangements that are in place where you reserve capacity on the chance that you may use it.
Mm. Okay. Jack, one final question on this. Do you think that a lot of the pushback that the Tesla owners are getting is, to me, it falls into 2 areas. One is, no, the superchargers are ours, you stay away, bad people coming in and encroaching on our area? Or is it a case of, we don't really care, what we don't want is queues at the supercharger. If you could guarantee that I can always charge, then I'm quite happy to open it up to anybody. Which of those do you think is the sort of the one that's pushing more people who own a Tesla to be against this?
I'm going to tread carefully with my answer here, Gary, because I have a nasty reputation of accidentally sort of triggering the extremist Tesla fan base of the internet when I speak on these issues. I think. I remember my favorite reaction to that question was my boss, Robert Llewellyn's answer, who is a Tesla Model 3 owner, when I asked him, and he sort of went, we should share them out, but his fists were clenched when he said it. I think that we're probably through that phase. There was a real identity attached with Tesla ownership in the early years because they were the only ones and they were by miles the best.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there was a certain pride attached with being part of that elite early adopters club. And I think that is subsiding now, that the competition is catching up and offering some properly good alternatives. And that's not to say that the shine has gone from Tesla. What you're left with is still an outstanding product, probably the best one in the Model 3. So my guess is that it's probably just about the fear of inconvenience. I've paid for this thing under these certain pretenses, and I don't want you to now take that away from me when I'm 1 year into a 3-year lease, because this isn't what we agreed to. So if I'm a Tesla owner and I'm midway through a lease deal, I just want to make sure that I'm not going to now be subjected to enormous queues and inconvenience, so that people who didn't buy into the brand can benefit.
Excellent. Any further comments, Stuart?
I think it's such a binary debate. It's going to be wrong whatever we say with this one, but my pitch would be we've got to think about what this is all about. It's not about having the best whatever in the street. It's about net zero and about getting low carbon technologies out there, and whatever's best for achieving that goal is the route we should be taking, in my view.
Yeah, totally agree. Right. I want to discuss the whole area of slow charging cars on fast charger. Ironically, we seem to have chosen topics which all relate to charging, which probably says something about the mindset of electric vehicle drivers. We've talked before on this podcast about the fact that oftentimes it's quicker to do a larger number of stops on a run, but only charge to, say, 60% before moving off, rather than doing a few long charges and cranking up to 85, 90%. But the one thing that this presupposes is that you have a suitable charger available when you arrive at a charge stop. So let's say, for example, you're someone like Jack who gets a fantastic fast car like a Taycan to drive around with, and you stop at Ionity or one of the grid-serve electric highway locations. You should get some pretty good charge speeds. But if you get there and the only charger that's available has got a BMW i3 sitting on it, pulling 48 kilowatts, or even worse, a Mazda MX-30 pulling 34 kilowatts average, that means you're sitting there waiting for a car to charge on a high-powered charger, but it's only using a fraction of what it can actually take. So, there are two schools of thought on this. The first one is that you shouldn't be using a high-powered charger if your car can't pull the charge on that level, which means that the MX-30, for example, shouldn't be allowed on that charger. Also, slower charging cars such as the i3 and the early leafs would be limited to 50 kilowatt chargers, which isn't an issue because they're not losing anything by doing that, as they wouldn't be able to charge above that level anyway. But the alternate school of thought on that is, well, so what? They got to the charger first. They should be able to use it. If the situation was reversed and they had to wait for the Taycan to charge, then they'd have to charge. They'd have to wait. What's the issue? Why is that an issue? And of course, the problem with the first school of thought is that it means slower charging cars are limited into which chargers they can use. But currently, with the number of 50 kilowatt chargers massively outnumbering the high power chargers, it shouldn't be an issue, at least not right now. The problem with the second school of thought is that you're not maximizing the potential for charging, an area where there are already too many challenges, as we've already discussed. And don't get me started on plug-in hybrids blocking charges but pulling 3.6 kilowatts maximum because they've attached to the AC connector. Presumably, it wouldn't be difficult to inhibit slower charging cars from charging on high-power chargers. But is this something we should do? I open it to the floor.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and there's one additional piece of information you'd want before having a view on that is there a lower rate charger available at that location? Because if there is, then it's almost it's rude to use a fast.
They're mocking you at that stage.
Yeah, exactly. That's almost like a deliberate act, isn't it? Whereas if it's the only unit available in that location, then are you really suggesting that these individuals be stranded because they haven't got a fast enough charge unit? So it needs to be in context, But the other thing is the design of charge stations. And again, it keeps coming about this flexibility thing. If you have multiple leads, because you could act perfectly honest, you can argue the same thing in terms of charge curve. There are times when the charge curve dropped off. Your car is only charging at maybe 20 kilowatts, and maybe be doing 100 because it's the end of, and it's still plugged in. Is that right, or is that wrong?
No.
And in some ways, the design of the charge bays themselves are having more connectors and more power electronics than you've actually got capacity is the way to do it, and use diversity and flexibility to manage the charging, so you can have maybe 3 or 4 cars charged or connected up at any particular point in time, but you manage that portfolio of charging as efficiently as possible. So there's a bit about charging infrastructure design in here and how it manages the opportunities of flexibility and diversity.
Jack?
It's a really interesting question, and I think really it speaks to one of the sort of, it's a very good problem to have, but one of the problems that we're facing at the moment is just how rapidly the technology is advancing, and as a result, how quickly technology starts to look outdated. Right, so you're VW, and you've just spent years and years and billions of pounds on this modular electric vehicle architecture, and you plan on building 90 different cars on top of it across your various brands, and then Kia Hyundai come along and they're like, oh, our one charges twice as fast as yours. And all of a sudden, all of your hard work looks like it's kind of, it just looks a bit outdated very quickly. So my knee-jerk reaction to that question is I don't think you can relegate people with slower charging cars to slower chargers only. I think, with chargers being a little bit more few and far between than we'd hope at this stage, banning people from using certain ones because they didn't spend slightly more on a slightly nicer car seems a bit mean. But equally, if you are in a Taycan or an Ioniq 5 and you arrive at one of the few really, really quick chargers, and you find a Mazda, as you say, plugged in, planning on spending the day there, that would be intensely frustrating. So I think there's a whole thing here, isn't there, about sort of charger etiquette. It's a new world that we're just really beginning to contemplate. I think to Stuart's point, the ideal is that the bank of chargers there are designed cleverly enough to sort of distribute the power accordingly, and that you don't have to worry about it too much. But I think my short answer is I unfortunately I don't think you can limit slower charging cars to slower chargers only, although I completely sympathize with the hypothetical frustration of having a faster charging car and being made to wait. So it's a bit of a non-answer, really, isn't it?
But what it does, it brings up another sort of related question to that. We've talked already about the grid-served electric highway ABB chargers, which allegedly can charge two vehicles from one unit at the same time. They haven't switched that functionality on at the moment, but they are intending on doing that. So if we get to the situation where you pull up at one of these, you've got the Mazda already plugged in, and you come in and you plug in your Taycan, should the software then go, oh, well, hang on, I'm now going to drop the rate down even more on the Mazda and put more of it towards the Taycan because it can take more? So should the balancing be done at that level? Or should we say, well, no, hang on, the Mazda will take as much as it can and the Taycan's just got to take what's left?
Stuart? Yeah, but it's a kind of combination of human behaviour, isn't it? And because effectively what you're doing there is on one basis you're sharing the same capacity, and one basis you're doing it on the basis of time. So it's you're charging one item as fast as you can, and then you're disconnecting, and you're connecting another item as fast as you can. You're disconnecting it. So you're sharing on time. And the other model, you're sharing in parallel. Yeah. Now, but from a human behavior perspective, knowing when that's going to be finished charging, knowing you're not having to wait, is a big psychological plus. So I think if you take the sort of psychology bit into it and remove the waiting from the process, I think that results in a much more pleasing experience for the EV owner. In the sense, you can go in, you can do something. You can go to the Costas or whatever you want to do. Whereas the waiting is the thing that I think you've got to try and minimise, because that's the bit that upsets people and results in charge range and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. Yeah.
I'm just mulling this over and figuring out what the fairest way would be. I mean, I suppose you could just do the old 50-50 split, but maybe you could if you had a charger that could sort of calculate the ratio, as it were, of what this car plugged into my left is capable of versus that one, sort of distribute the power based on that. There's a million different ways that you could do it, isn't it? And it's, because we sit at chargers for longer than we sit at petrol stations, this is a brave new world of sort of social dilemmas that we're just contemplating for the very first time, and it's a nice problem to have, I suppose.
It is, and it does bring up something that you mentioned a few moments ago, which is the whole concept of charger etiquette. Like, it's things that maybe you wouldn't think about. For example, we'll go back to GridServe again. If you go up to the site at Rugby, they've got the 12 ABB units next to the 12 Tesla Superchargers. And the ABB units, 6 of them are dual CHAdeMO and CCS, and 6 of them are dual CCS. And that's fine, don't have a problem with that. But if you're a CCS, if you're driving a CCS car, should you be using a CCS charger that's on a dual CHAdeMO CCS unit if there are dual CCS units available? Because that means that someone who's coming in and needs a CHAdeMO may not be able to get on, because even though CHAdeMO is available, you're blocking it because you're using the CCS connector at one that also has a CHAdeMO. And 99% of CCS drivers would not think of that at all until you raise the point, and then they go, oh yeah, actually I should be going straight to the ones that are dual CCS because, I only need CCS and it frees up a CHAdeMO one for somebody else. It's all etiquette, isn't it?
So it's an interesting one as well. And I'd suggest as well at this, this point, we're kind of beyond early uptake, but when we're still the minority, you've got people that have bought an electric vehicle because they've actually consciously thought about it. When you get to the point where people are buying electric vehicles because they have to, is that willingness to abide by these etiquettes going to continue? So what do we need to do to kind of prepare for that world where you've got everybody, engaged and otherwise, looking to charge an electric vehicle? Because that'd be quite a different world, I think, from where we have at the moment. It's all very polite around a charge point, generally speaking, in my experience. That will change. It'll become more like trying to get a parking space at Tesco's. Yeah.
That's a very good point. I think there's a whole sort of separate podcast episode to be had on charger etiquette, how it is,
Absolutely,
how it can happen. So fabulous. Have we done this topic to death, do you think?
I think we've done it pretty thoroughly.
I think that brings the roundtable discussion to an end. I'd like to thank Jack and Stuart for their time and input. I think it's been an interesting discussion, as these roundtables often are. So now it's time for a cool EV or renewable thing to share with you listeners. Jack, what was yours?
Yes, well, I was at the Goodwood Festival Speed last week, the week before last, which is one of my favourite places in the world. I've been going since I was quite young, and it's extremely exciting to see the EV presence at the show swell year upon year, and also just see interest for the EV presence at the show grow significantly, because it really is a petrol head's world, that place. You've got, old Senna Formula One cars knocking about, and yet people are actually showing interest in electric supercars and sports cars and all sorts of other things. So very cool. But one thing that really caught my eye was one of several sort of urban quadricycle type things, in the spirit of the Renault Twizy. We've seen them before. This one was called the Microlino. Or Microlino. I'm going to go Microlino. A couple things that are interesting about it. For one, it's clearly inspired design-wise by the BMW Isetta bubble car. Do you guys remember that thing?
Yeah.
A really quirky little three-wheeled petrol car originally.
Reverse gear. That's the one, isn't it? Yeah.
One of the interesting things about it was the entire front of the car was the door. So you open the door and the sort of steering wheel flies away from you and you climb out of the front. Not ideal for sort of tight parking spots. But it's a beautiful little retro electric city car. It's also, when I say micro, the logo is the same micro logo as the folding metal scooter I had when I was 8 years old. It's that micro. Same company, or at least same branding. So presumably that means when you close the door of the Microlino, it sort of bangs your ankle really hard as you're climbing in. But it was a great looking thing. 120 miles of urban range, seating for two, spacious seating for two, and it starts at around €12,000. And they were telling me that they've had over 10,000 pre-orders for these things.
Wow.
And I was just absolutely charmed by it. And when I see little electric quadricycles like that, I think about small electric cars like the Honda E and the Mini Electric, and they all of a sudden just seem a bit unnecessarily large and expensive. I think if you just need 100 miles of range and to be able to pop around town, a little quadricycle like that just makes so much more sense. And I really hope that we see an uptake for that type of vehicle in the near future.
Yeah, it's a specific use case, and I think there's there's the need to have something that can fill that specific use case that's not big and expensive and unwieldy. So excellent. Thank you for that. Stuart, do you have anything?
No, well, I have actually, yeah, and I was just thinking, following on from that, one of the ones I found quite nice was that there's a company, Archimoto, across in the States, which is a really interesting product, kind of along that sort of lines. But the point I was going to make, I thought I'd just kind of stick to the same theme. I've been talking about flexibility a fair bit, but one of the things I think is cool is that the networks that we're not just targeting flexibility in the EV world. One of the things we've got, the reason it's kind of relevant is we've just put out 37 zones just this week, actually. We're looking for other demand, other organizations that can reduce their demand on the network to create capacity for electric vehicle charging or other new low carbon technologies. So we're going out and we're asking, whether there's local factories, business, heating systems, whatever it is, and we're saying if you turn your demand down at these times, we will pay you money. And that reduction in demand frees up the capacity for electric vehicle charging and other new demands coming into the system. So I think it's cool because it's kind of going beyond the immediate problem, which is how do you get that charger connected? And it's thinking about, how do you solve this problem more broadly across the network? And it's a bit industry geeky, but I think it's cool.
Oh, absolutely. And then that starts to then go into things like time of day tariffs for home users, where they, sort of shift their usage to a time where the electricity is a little bit cheap to try and reduce the load on the
Absolutely.
network.
Yeah, all links into the very similar thing. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. My cool thing relates to Formula E. Hopefully, as fans of electric cars, you've all been watching the Formula E Championship as it's progressed from the early days of, two cars with a pit stop to change in the middle, right up to the current racing with all the fan boosts and the activation zones and the better performing cars. Now, one thing that's built into the Formula E ethos is safety, from the design of the cars, the design of the tracks, the emergency processes for getting a driver out of a car with a battery short circuit, right down to the safety car itself. Formula E have produced a video showing some of the different aspects of the driver, the track, and the vehicle safety. And it's a fascinating 15-minute look at how things are designed to minimize risk and maximize the safety to everybody at the circuit. Plus, you get a look inside that custom designed mini safety car. It's a great little video. The link is in the show notes. So if you've got 15 minutes, have a quick look at that. And that's the show for today. Hope you enjoyed listening to it. Thanks again to my guests Stuart and Jack for their time and input. If you want to contact me, I can be emailed at evmusings@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at musingsev. If you want to support the podcast and the newsletter, please consider contributing to become an EV Musings patron. The link is in the show notes. Don't want to sign up for something on a monthly basis? Well, if you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/evmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/evmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. If you want a quick reference ebook to read on your Kindle, I wrote a little something called So You've Got an Electric. It's available on Amazon worldwide for the measly sum of 99p or equivalent, and it's a great little introduction to living with an electric car. At the moment it's free on Kindle Unlimited, or if you're in the Kindle Lending Library. Please check it out. Links for everything we've talked about in the podcast today are in the description. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe. It's available on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave a review, preferably 5 stars, as it helps raise visibility and extend our reach in search engines. If you've reached this part of the podcast and you're still listening, thank you. Much appreciated. Why not let me know you've got to this point by tweeting me at musingsev with the words 100 episodes. Hashtag if you know you know. Nothing else. Thanks as always to my co-founder Simon. From a young age he's been a big fan of Jaffa cakes, always takes them everywhere. But don't try and get him to give you one, they're his. Or they were until his wife told him he'd be taking their daughter to ballet every week for a year unless he changed his tune. And his daughter will only go to ballet if whoever takes her is wearing a pink tutu.
He sort of went, we should share them out, but his fists were clenched when he said it.
I'm Gary, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.